Play is the Thing, with your host, Judy Sleed. Today's guest, Jim Thurman, U.S. Citizen.
Yes, hello once again to the Play is the Thing, and I'm very lucky to have Jim Thurman come back and talk to us about the theater. Hi, Jim.
Hello, Judy.
And you have so many interesting things to say about music. You're always going to shows and operas. So where did you get this enthusiasm for the theater?
Well, I have to say it started when I was very young, and I guess my parents really introduced me to it. I grew up, of course, in England during the Second World War.
No one would ever know.
During the Second World War. And,
Yes.
of course, during the war, there was very little theatre, particularly in, as they say outside of London, the suburbs where I lived. I lived close to the city of Coventry and grew up there, as I said. There was a theatre in Coventry, but during the war, it had if I remember correctly, it had very, very few shows playing there because it was bombed constantly, blitzed terribly during the war.
That theater was?
No, because the city of Coventry.
I thought
the
maybe
city
they
of Coventry.
hated the theater. They
No.
kept bombing it.
I don't think they were aiming at the theatre. They were
I
going
see.
after the factories. But unfortunately, they missed the factories and totally smashed down the center of the city, including the beautiful old cathedral. But that is another story. Anyway, shortly after the war finished in 1945, about 1947-48, American shows started coming over from Broadway to the West End. The West End is what they call the theatre district in London, as they call on Broadway the Great White Way. The West End in London is its equivalent. And so one of the first shows to come, excuse me, was Oklahoma, followed shortly afterwards by Annie Get Your Gun and then Kiss Me Kate, etc. And as they do on Broadway, the London shows then get a touring show that tour, as the Londoners like to say, the suburbs. And Coventry happened to be one of the stops on this provincial tour. And so my parents took me to see Oklahoma there, the touring show, of course. Dolores Gray was in the original London cast in London, but of course she didn't come to Coventry. It was just another star that was touring in the group. Oklahoma, Annie Get Your Gun, and Kiss Me Kate, and I just fell in love with them when my parents took me there to see them. And then my father bought me, pretty soon after that, new equipment came out for recording, like they introduced, as we called it in those days, the 33 1/3, which is now called the vinyl.
Yes,
you know, LPs, the record.
Yes,
and
I remember that.
These were just being introduced into England at that time. And so my father bought me a new electric player that would play both these and the old 78s, the old wax discs. And one of the first records he bought for me was the original cast album of Oklahoma. So I just played it, and I knew absolutely every song by heart, and used to drive my parents crazy singing this over and over. And then it followed shortly afterwards by Annie Get Your Gun and then Kiss Me Kate and so on. Anyway, that started me on my collection. At the age of 18, I left home and went into the British Armed Services. And I was stationed close to London, which gave me, of course, the opportunity on my days off to go into London and go to the theatre.
Yes.
And of course, being in the army, I didn't get much of a salary. It was just a little stipend, you know, like I've forgotten something like maybe £3, which is the equivalent of about $6. But of course, that went a long way in those days. And I could go to the theatre in London and sit in the gallery, or as we called it then, the gods, way, way back.
The balcony.
And it would cost me only 2 and 6p, which was like about 25 cents. And I used to have to stand at the theatre in line at the theatre box office to get this, you know, for that performance.
But you just
anyway,
had to
but
go.
I loved it, and I saw so many shows that way in London. Not only the big American shows like The King and I and South Pacific and Carousel and so on, but a few of the English shows that were still being written and produced, of course, because many, as you're probably aware, many British shows have been written and indeed have come over here. I mean,
Yes.
like Andrew Lloyd Webber has brought many of his shows over here. Well, in those days, of course, we had Noel Coward writing shows. We had Ivan Novello and Julian Slade and Wilson, who wrote The Boyfriend, and so on. And so these shows were playing alongside the Broadway shows in the West End.
So they were not all musicals.
All of those I've mentioned would have been musicals or revues, what they called revues, which was a kind of, a revue was kind of little individual scenes of a skit, a sketch, and they could be amusing or they could be serious. But more often than not, they were downright silly, you know, and you had it was just done for escapism. You know, you went to the theatre to escape the drudgery of your life, and so you could laugh at all these funny things. And so there were a lot of reviews in those days with famous English stars like B. Lilly and Gertrude Lawrence and of course Noel Coward and Dora Bryan, and who's not very well known over here, but she was quite well known in England. And so I spent a lot of time on my days off doing these. And unlike Broadway, the London theatre has different matinee days. Some theatres have a matinee on a Tuesday, some on Wednesday, and some on Thursday, and then almost all of them have one on Saturday. So you got an opportunity to go to the theatre much more often than you do on Broadway.
Day. So that's what you did with your stipend.
And sometimes, Judy, I was absolutely ridiculous. I'd go to a matinee, as soon as it finished, rush over to the next theatre, get in line for the evening performance of that one.
Wow.
But I was young and I enjoyed it. But I have a few stories about first nights. After a while, then of course I finished my army duty and I decided to become a registered nurse. So I applied for my nursing education, again close to London, and I got into a hospital there, and I spent 3 years doing my general nursing, and then 2 years doing psychiatric nursing, 5 years altogether.
Psychiatric nursing?
Yes.
You never told me that. I hope you're not psychoanalyzing me right now.
Hardly. My head is full of fluff at the moment. Anyway, Once I got into the hospital, and I'd become much more familiar with the theatre system then, and opening nights were a big thing to go to, of course. And the gallery, again, the gods, was always the last place to go. I mean, the celebrities always wanted to sit in the orchestra or the grand circle. So the gods, the balcony, was available to people like me. So I used to write weeks and weeks ahead when I knew a show was going to open at a particular theatre and get first night tickets, which I did for shows like Plain and Fancy. I saw first night of that. Fanny, saw the first night of that. West Side Story, which was absolutely incredible, and indeed had Chita Rivera in it in London, as well as, of course, on Broadway. And I went to the first night of it. And on the first night there, I used to stand close to the red carpet where the celebs walked into the theatre. And then when it was about 5 minutes to theatre time, I would rush round and climb all the steps to the gods and take my seat. But while I was in line watching the celebs come to West Side Story, who should come in but Rudolph Nureyev and Margot Fonteyn? Wow. And they walked right by me, and I reached out and touched Rudolph Nureyev's coat sleeve.
Oh my gosh, and you felt you were in heaven.
It was I mean, you know, I think most people adored him as a dancer, of course. And I had seen him a number of times. Anyway, that's how I saw the first night of West Side Story. But I have a rather interesting story about My Fair Lady. It opened, I believe, in 1958 in London. I couldn't get a first night ticket. They were sold out weeks in advance. And so this friend and I, who we were now working or doing our training at the Bethlehem Royal Hospital, which was the original Bedlam. Bethlehem, it had been changed from Bedlam to Bethlehem, Bethlehem Royal Hospital. And so we went from there taking blankets with us. And what we did is we camped out all night on the pavement by the theatre, and then at 10 o'clock the next morning, the box office opened, and they sold standing room only tickets. So we slept on the pavement. Thank goodness it didn't rain that night. And we wrapped up in these blankets with Royal Bethlehem printed across them, and we just hoped that the press wouldn't come and take photographs of all these people, because then the hospital would see us with these blankets, which we shouldn't have had, of course. But anyway, as a result, we did get the tickets the next morning. We rushed back to the hospital, got a day's sleep, and then came back to watch the show. And I have to say, it was one of the most spectacular first nights I have ever attended. I mean, anybody who was anybody was in the audience that night. There was Laurence Olivier and Vivian Leigh, Noel Coward, Ivan Novello.
Gertrude Lawrence.
No, Gertrude Lawrence was over here, I think, appearing in The King and I, or she might have already died, I'm not sure, because she died while she was appearing in The King and I. We saw, Ingrid Bergman, and Kay Walsh, Dirk Bogarde. Anyway, there was so many celebrities. It was just incredible. I mean, we were looking at the audience as much as we were looking at the show. But anyway, and then if you remember, and what we did that morning, they took up, before the box office opened, someone from the front of the queue walked along and collected money. And what he did, he went to the florist, because the My Fair Lady opened at Drury Lane Theatre, which is in Covent Garden. So he went to the Covent Garden flower market, bought a box of fresh violets, took them to the stage door so that they could be presented to Julie Andrews from the standees. And we hoped that she might put these in her basket, because in her first scene in My Fair Lady, she is a flower seller, and she's selling violets. Anyway, I don't know if you remember, about a year or a year and a half ago, Julie Andrews published a book called, I think, Home. And it was all about her experience growing up in England as the daughter of two musical stars. Her father and her mother were, I've forgotten their names, but I know they're Andrews, something Andrews, and they appeared in comedy sketches and on the BBC radio. Anyway, she wrote in her book about this, that she said, the last night of the previews, before opening night, I was amazed to walk outside and find all these people lined up waiting to buy gallery tickets. And she said the next day they presented me with this box of violets. So I thought, well, that's wrong, because we were standees. So I wrote a letter to Miss Andrews through her publisher, and I said, you know, I beg to differ with you over your comment that the people waiting in line overnight were for the gallery. I said the gallery had been sold out months ahead. I said, and we were waiting as standees. I said, so I hope you don't mind me correcting you. And I said, no, I was one of those people that gave either my tanner or my bob, which is a slang for a shilling or a sixpence, towards your box of violets. But I never had a reply from her.
Well, maybe
so maybe she'll see this show and she'll get a hint.
She'll have a chance to watch this show 4 times a week, because she lives out here.
Yes, sometimes she does. Yes, in the summer, I know. Yes.
So I'm just, you had seen all these shows in London, but then I guess you had seen these shows in New York also.
Well, of course, I didn't come to New York until 1960. Now, it was in 1958 that I saw My Fair Lady. I came to New York in 1960, and then, of course, I continued. So
how do you compare the productions?
Well, I have to say...
Of course, when you came to New York, you didn't have to look at all the celebrities like you did in London.
Well, I've got a few stories about that, too. I bumped into a few famous people in the New York theater, too. I once bumped into Ethel Merman, who gave me quite a frown. Because I bumped into her rather hard.
Yeah.
No, I didn't even know she was there. I just bumped into her and said sorry, and she turned around. But anyway, I've forgotten my train of thought now about the British
Comparing
theatre.
the shows?
Oh, yes. The London shows, shows like that needed a lot of dancing, like Oklahoma and Kiss Me, Kate. In those days, the male dancers in England were very effeminate, unlike the American dancers, which were very masculine. I mean, I know that a lot of the American dancers, well, not a lot, but a few of them are gay, but they still carry it off as being quite masculine, whereas the English male dancers seem to be rather effeminate. And so when one went to see Oklahoma, you didn't see these big butch, you know, cowboys dancing, you saw little fairies dancing. You know? But it satisfied the British public. So, but that's a big difference between. But I must say that has changed now. The English male dancer seems to have become a lot more masculine. But in those days, they were rather effeminate, and but that is a big difference. as to over here. And of course, being more masculine, they're much more vigorous in their dancing, you know, like in Kiss Me Kate, which calls for a lot of really high jumps and really big production numbers. I found that in London it wasn't as good. But then I can't say about the original here, of course. I've only seen revivals here. But the last revival I saw on Broadway, the male dancers were, as were the female dancers, of course, absolutely superb. But compared to my memory of when I saw them at the Coventry Theatre on tour, you know. But, I also, of course, not only did I see musical theatre, but I saw a lot of classical theatre too. For example, while I was in London, the Old Vic, which was then one of the only theatre companies that produced classic plays like Shakespeare, Shaw, and so on. The Old Vic mounted the entire cycle of Shakespeare's plays. And they did like 6 a year for 5 years. And they had incredible stars in them. I mean, I remember seeing Henry V with Richard Burton. And I remember seeing Othello with Richard Burton. What he did in Othello, he played Othello one night, and then the next he would play Iago, and so on. He alternated every night. And it was incredible to see his performance doing that.
Wow.
And Sir Laurence Olivier and John Gielgud. And I remember John Gielgud and Edith Evans. Edith Evans was quite elderly then. And he was playing Henry VIII, and she was playing either his mother or something, I can't remember a part. But when she came to do her very first number, she froze. And the whole stage stood, you know, frozen. And then someone gave her her feed, and then she continued, and it went on. But I'll never forget that. I think that's the only time I've ever seen a great actor or actress freeze on the stage. Yeah, but she was quite elderly. I mean, she was way up in her 80s then. And so it was understandable. But,
I'm just wondering, did you prepare for this show? I mean, you are just so knowledgeable with all the names of the shows and the people who were in it and everything. I'm wondering whether you studied, you rehearsed to come on.
No, no. Although, having said that, no, I'm particularly not about the theatre aspect, no. I'm preparing a paper which I'm supposed to be presenting at NYU musical department sometime this year, because I had a vast collection of vinyl recordings.
Yeah,
every Broadway show that was ever put on vinyl, I had a copy of it. And then once they deleted the vinyl and started with the CDs, I had every Broadway and off-Broadway show that had been put onto CD. And I decided that since I'm getting older and don't know when anything might happen to me, I didn't want this collection to be wasted. So first of all, I contacted the school in Lincoln Center, and I'm blocking the name now.
You froze.
Yes, I have, yes. Anyway, they don't have a musical department. They have a theatrical department, and they have dancing and classical music, but not a musical comedy department, as it were. Whereas NYU did, and I contacted them, and they said they would be delighted to have it. So I did indeed, last year, donate that entire collection to NYU.
Wow.
So that the future students who are writing musicals and so on will have a historical background if they wish to listen to these old recordings that might help them in developing their own writing skills, you know. As I said, I did that rather than have it all broken up and probably, who knows, end up in a yard sale or in a thrift shop or something.
Yeah.
So, and now...
Very rare, those
yes,
vinyls.
now I have the entire collection of London shows, all on vinyl and on CDs. And the London shows, of course, are repeats, many of them are repeats of the Broadway shows. For example, like South Pacific, Annie Get Your Gun, and so on, but with an English cast, not the American cast.
And do you have like one of those instruments to play it on?
Oh, yes. I still have a turntable, yes.
You do?
Yes. And I can play them. But I must confess, I don't play them as often as I would like to.
I remember those old machines. It was called His Meister's Voice.
His Master's Voice, yeah. Yes.
I used to have that turntable.
And their symbol, of course, was the big old horn with the old-fashioned crank
yeah, with a little
box,
dog.
And the arm that had the steel needle. In fact, during the war, that is exactly the type of record player I had. It had belonged to my father. And I used that to play, and all we had were these old musical comedy 78s that my father had bought when he was like 20, 30, in his 1920s, you know, age. And he had collected them. And I had a stack like this. So I used to play stupid little songs like I have never seen a straight banana and things like that. I mean, they were ridiculous songs because they came from vaudeville, you know.
Well, as you said, Jim, you're going to have to come back and talk about it more because we already used up 30 minutes.
I can't believe it.
Well, I can't believe it either.
But I would be delighted to, and then perhaps I can continue my saga and talk about the Broadway shows.
Bring in some music, and then we could either listen to some or even just look at the picture, what it looks like. I have a whole bunch of 33 albums, and I haven't touched them for years. I wonder if it's still playing.
Well, sure. The albums will play if you have something to play them on. They never deteriorate unless
but they could warp.
Oh, they can, yes, they can warp. But having said that, they can still play even if they're warped. They might jump a little bit.
Yeah, because I have a lot of 33 records and with shows. Because every time I went to see a Broadway show, I brought the record.
Oh, yes. Well, that's just what I did, of course.
Yes.
Sometimes I bought the record before the show and learned and got familiar with the score so that I was, you know, familiar with it.
I helped